a quiet bay on the southern shore of Newfoundland's Avalon Peninsula, a tourist will find a slow and easy pace of living in an old, historic settlement where much of the life is still tied to the sea and the simple tilling of the soil. This is Ferryland, a settlement established over 3.5 centuries ago by George Calvert, later Lord Baltimore, who subsequently moved south to what was then known as Virginia and established another colony, which is now the state of Maryland, with its capital city named in honor of its founder. In the early, freewheeling years of this continent's history, an English settlement like this one had to hold its own against marauding pirates, privateers, and French warships. The relics of the early fortifications are still on the shores and the islands for all to see. The old guns have long been silent, and Ferryland is now a very peaceful place. A lighthouse that has served as Ferryland's Atlantic beacon for more than 100 years is now a museum, housing many things of local historical interest. From its tower, one can look far out over the ocean, across which the bold adventurers of the past came sailing to write the stirring pages of the history of Newfoundland, carving its niche in the foundation of the New World. The first of the great explorations was made by the Norsemen about 1,000 years ago, in ships that depended upon their oars as much as their sails to make their long and difficult journeys. In recorded history, the discovery of Newfoundland is credited to John Cabot, who sailed from Bristol, England, in 1497 under the sponsorship of King Henry VII. His reports of the abundance of fish in the coastal waters spread through maritime Europe, and fishing ships from another country soon became regular visitors to Newfoundland. In the year 1583, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, with his flagship Squirrel, sailed into the harbor of St. John's and gathered the fishermen of various nationalities then in port to hear his formal proclamation, reaffirming English sovereignty over Newfoundland in the name of Queen Elizabeth I. St. John's was an ideal choice as the principal port of the island, a natural, landlocked harbor, safely sheltered by high cliffs and entered only through a narrow passage that could easily be defended against attack by the sea. The forts and battle sites are marked to guide the visitors of today and to help them visualize the ebb and flow of the tides of war during the 17th and 18th centuries, when the French and English sporadically struggled for possession of Newfoundland for more than 100 years. Still to be seen are some of the old guns which have guarded the harbor mouth from this low angle at the south side of the entrance, as well as from the heights of Signal Hill on the north. Under these old guns now pass in peace the ships of most of the countries of the world. For those who would know what the old forts were like in the days of their glory, there are realistic models of the Narrows, the bay, and the hills surrounding St. John's, ports from which this strategic bastion of the British Empire could be watched over and... In spite of its apparent impregnability, the French captured St. John's 3 times, in 1696, in 1708, and in 1762, only to have the British return in sufficient strength to recapture the port again on each occasion. Today, St. John's is a city of more than 100,000 people, a city where the old world meets the new. With pride in its past as an early cradle of New World history, it is very much a city of the present and the future, the vital, expanding capital of Canada's newest province, At Kitty Vitty, a tiny fishing village adjacent to the harbor, another old fort has been restored to let us feel the spell of history. Old guns have been preserved, and an interested visitor may, on occasion, watch one being charged and fired, or may even play the part of the gunner. Since the earliest ocean crossings, the Portuguese have come to Newfoundland to fish the Grand Banks. Their long association with the island and its people is symbolized by a gift from Portugal. This statue of Gaspar Corte Real, a famous Portuguese navigator who made an adventurous but fatal voyage of exploration to Newfoundland's coastal waters in 1500. The major French stronghold in Newfoundland was located at Placentia, in the southwest sector of the Avalon Peninsula. Here they built a fort on Castle Hill to protect the town across the bay from attack by either land or sea. The fort, shown here in model form, commanded this view of the hill and the bay, and could help protect the narrow entrance of the inner harbor, where transient French supply vessels and naval craft found sheltered anchorage. The French had followed the Basques to Placentia in the middle years of the 17th century. They occupied and fortified the settlement as the headquarters base for their prolonged naval and military adventures in Newfoundland, finally relinquishing possession under the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. Today, the waters of the bay sparkle in a brilliant view from this fine lookout. The old fort is in the process of restoration. From it, a visitor will be able to look out to sea or across the bay to the quiet old town of Placentia, readily reached now by car over a bridge across the channel. Some local fishermen still cure cod for their own use by hanging the split and salted fish to dry on line, unlike the bulk of the commercial catch, which is sold fresh to processing plants or salted and sun-cured on wooden drying platforms known as flakes. The tides flow through the channel from the inner to the outer bay like a river running deep. And there the fishing boats rest by the wharves when the catches are in. They are boats of intriguing design, home-built as they have always been. They present a peaceful scene beside the fields where the cannon of the early settlers once roared defiance at enemies sweeping in from the sea. Across the Avalon, in Conception Bay, lies Cupid's, where John Guy of Bristol made one of the earliest attempts at colonization in 1610, when he built his sea forest plantation under a charter from King James I. Many of the original pioneers remained ascendantly in the area when the plantation project failed to prosper. Today, the fishermen of Cupid's carry on their time-honored trade, setting their nets in the waters of the bay and spreading them for drying and repairs in the hay meadows along the shore. There is an enduring pattern in the way of life in Cupid's and the many other villages of Avalon, unhurried and, in many ways, unchanged by the passing of time. Along the shores of Conception Bay, history beckons often to the traveler. There are still tales of the old-time pirates like Easton and Kelly, who frequently operated from this bay, since the Avalon was close to the trade routes of the Atlantic. Newfoundland offered a long and irregular coastline with 1,000 remote hideaways for a pirate in trouble or with treasure to hide. Buccaneers have vanished in the mists of history, but tourists today can find their own treasure trove of sightseeing fascination in this great bay and elsewhere in historic Avalon. Heart's Content is on the highway along the Trinity Bay shore of the Avalon Peninsula. Just one of many examples of Newfoundland's colorful place names, it is a few miles north of neighboring villages named Heart's Delight and Heart's Desire. The tranquil charm of the typical Newfoundland coastal village lingers here as it does in most of the island's outports. The rugged little fishing boats lie quietly at anchor or rest when the owners are not out on the bay harvesting the bounty of the sea. The family dog is much a part of the local scene. Water dogs, working dogs, playmates and companions for young and old. The trappings of the fishery are seen along the shoreline. Frequently, it is old-fashioned gear that has seen many years of service. But now it's often mixed with items such as nets made of nylon and other modern equipment. The local boats come in from their offshore fishing areas, the daily routine continuing as it has for many generations. The fishermen check and maintain the tools of their trade, readying the gear after each trip for the rigors of the next, patiently working at the multitude of chores which must be handled in the course of the fishing season. The modest little village of Heart's Content occupies an important place in the history of transatlantic communication. It was here, in 1866, that Cyrus Field's cable ship, the Great Eastern, brought to land the western end of the first successful Atlantic cable, opening a new era of direct telegraphic communication between North America and Europe. There's a subtle sense of living history underlying the placid tenor of life in the Avalon villages in an environment that gives insight into centuries past. At Hibbs Cove, there is a small museum where things of local interest are gradually being gathered, donated by the residents of the community. There are ship models and ship's gear, handmade and well-worn. Old guns that could tell many a tale. Clocks that knew great times and measured the minutes of bygone adventures. Carefully crafted waterproof boots of sealskin. Iron, wrought in primitive forges to serve specific needs. And spruce and raw, carefully interwoven to conquer the drifts of snow. Near the southern tip of the Avalon lies the village of Trepassey, on a protected harbor where history found a home in the early transatlantic flights. This was one of the resting spots on the first round-the-world flight, made by a United States Navy seaplane in May of 1919. Brave men in flimsy ships, facing the broad Atlantic, here took another step forward into the great age of air transportation. In the continuing saga of pioneering flights, it was Alcock and Brown who, in June of 1919, first conquered the full Atlantic in a World War I Vickers-Vimy bomber, assembled in a pasture on the outskirts of St. John. After enduring the long, lonesome hours over the threatening ocean, to these two pilots came the great honor of being the first to conquer the Atlantic from shore to shore, out of communication, entirely on their own. A marker stands on the site from which they flew, out, over the Narrows, and across the sea to a rough landing in an Irish bog, and a warm welcome by Winston Churchill on behalf of the British government. More often than not, success was mixed with failure, and the list of brave pilots who were not so fortunate is a long one. The world waited tensely for the news that reached them through the banner headlines. And Newfoundland's Avalon was the spot on which their interest most often centered. The world was saddened by each failure and cheered by each success. One of the lucky ones was Amelia Earhart, foremost aviatrix of her day. Alone in her Lockheed Vega, she took off from a field at Harbor Grace on Conception Bay shore at a spot now marked by a commemorative monument. The airstrip on a hill overlooking the town of Harbor Grace is still there. There are plans to restore this historic runway, and a modern pilot will be able to experience the feeling of reenacting early events in aviation history as he roars down the runway to climb over the rocky knoll at the eastern end, where Amelia Earhart and other pioneers looked down on the last land before flying on over the open ocean to Europe. Lindbergh was lucky too, and on his historic flight in May of 1927, his last sight of North America was the view as he passed over St. John and flew on out through the Narrows at the mouth of the harbor to carry on across the sea. He flew out over ships that airplanes have come to replace as the basic transatlantic passenger carriers. Returning to Newfoundland in 1933 with his wife Anne in a seaplane, Lindbergh pioneered a world travel route for Pan American. His landing point at Bay Bulls, near St. John's, is marked by a monument. Much of the Avalon is still as it was when Lindbergh saw it then. The wild country is still fresh and untouched. The wild meadows are as green as ever, and the lakes still glow sapphire in the sun. Anglers who hike in find wild trout and clean water to delight the soul. Hunters will find the game still there in a beautiful and tranquil setting. Flying there now, a pilot will see the same fresh green fields stretching away from the roads and villages. He will see the same rocky cliffs that rise abruptly from the sea. The same safe anchorages with the neat cottage added around them, but connected now by excellent highways. On the broad Conception Bay waters, he will see holiday groups out jigging for cod, and schools of giant tuna in this world-famous area with eager sport fishermen in pursuit. He will see Baie de Verde, where the northwest tip of Avalon separates Trinity and Conception Bay, a striking, picturesque village that is the home port of a sizable fishing fleet. Anyone interested in the Avalon store of history will surely visit the capital city. There, behind the anchors and the old guns that mark the fortification at the Narrows, he will look out on the ships that sail through them to the ports of the world. Behind the Cabot Tower that overlooks the harbor entrance, he will find the inner city and the rich mixture of old and new that is St. John. A cable ship that maintains the communications chain established a century ago may be berthed on the waterfront. Standing close to a Portuguese fishing vessel, newly arrived from the Grand Banks. Here in St. John's, the blending of the past with the present is readily apparent in the ships seen in the harbor and in the architecture of the city itself. Housed in the Newfoundland Museum are the artifacts and the books and the documents that hold a hoard of history's treasures. Among them, the portraits of key figures in local history and a record of their deeds. Sir David Kirk, who took over the Crown lands at Ferryland, originally granted to and abandoned by George Calvert, who had moved to sunnier climes 8 years before. Captain Abram Kane, one of the outstanding skippers of the early sealing expeditions, when Newfoundlanders braved the Arctic ice floes and the extremes of difficulty and danger, seizing this seasonal opportunity in their endless striving for a marginal livelihood. Captain Bob Bartlett, famed Arctic navigator, who, in his ship the Morrissey, pioneered exploration of far northern seas and took Admiral Peary on his expedition to the North Pole. The story of the Atlantic Cable is there, and the history of the wireless telegraph, dramatized and brought to worldwide attention and use by Guglielmo Marconi, who, on the high point of Signal Hill, received the first transatlantic wireless signal in 1901. The history of Avalon, as an early base of European settlement, was integral to the pattern of development in North America. It is here, in the stories and artifacts of the Beothuk Indians who once lived on the island of Newfoundland, and the native Eskimos of Labrador. The story of the Vikings, the first Europeans to cross the northern seas to the New World, and the historical notes of John Cabot and his 1497 discovery of the Newfoundland are here, documenting the long chain of events that led to the colonization of the North American continent and to the eventual emergence of the two neighboring nations which now share their vast territories in a peaceful and harmonious relationship that has its roots in a common heritage.